Steiner, the President of the World Affairs Council. I'd like to welcome you all, especially those of you who may be new to the Council, for the launch of our Millennial Membership and Program Series. Please take a moment, the obligatory announcement, to silence your cell phones and any other electronic devices. Hey, you can have a speaker in. Just making sure. However, we do encourage you to tweet about the program at the conclusion of the program, and of course, ask you to like the Council on Facebook. As you know, most of you who've chosen to be with us this evening, the Council's new membership program and series has been named for A.J. Raju, managing partner of the Reed Smith Law Firm here in Philadelphia, and absolutely one of the most entrepreneurial and enlightened civic leaders in our community today. A.J. and Reed Smith have provided the Council with support that's targeted to the creation and execution of this program series, and we're really very grateful. Precisely because he's very much in demand for the qualities I just mentioned. A.J. can't be with us this evening. He's at a board meeting of the Philadelphia Museum of Art. In his stead, we have Alex Braden of Reed Smith, who A.J. described to me as one of the rising stars of our community and of his firm. Alex was also a participant in the World Affairs Council's Global Leadership Institute class in 2012. Let me welcome Alex to say a few words before we turn to the substance of our speaker this evening.
Hi, everybody. As Greg mentioned, my name is Alex Braden. I am a colleague of A.J. Raju's. As Greg mentioned, A.J. unfortunately is not able to be here tonight due to insurmountable scheduling conflicts. So he asked me to be his emissary here to extend his apologies, and more importantly, his sincere appreciation to the World Affairs Council and to all of you for taking part in this inaugural event of the Millennial Membership and Program Series, and I'm proud to say that I'm among the ranks of the Millennial members here tonight. For more than 60 years, the World Affairs Council of Philadelphia has served as an invaluable resource for globally minded Philadelphians, as a bridge between our little corner of the Commonwealth and the world at large. And with the launch of the Millennial Membership and Program Series, the Council and A.J. are re-emphasizing how important it is that members of our generation walk that bridge, that we engage with the world around us, allow that engagement to inform our opinions, shape our values, and to give us the tools that we need to challenge consensus and so-called conventional wisdom, something upon which tonight's guests can certainly give a masterclass. So once again, on behalf of A.J. Raju, let me extend my thanks to the World Affairs Council and to all of you for being involved, being engaged, and being here tonight. With that, back to you.
Thanks, Alex. So, as you all know, this series is aimed at students and professionals between the ages of 23 and 40, though you'll note we did not check anybody's birth certificate at the door, and we're certainly not excluding the remainder of the Council's memberships from these programs when they find the topics interesting. It's our intention to feature topics and speakers and venues that are specifically designed with young professionals in mind, and that offer some of the best and brightest innovators that are making headlines today. And this inaugural program obviously sends the right signal in terms of those ambitions. It's a regrettable fact, highlighted in the media, I think all too frequently, that adults under 40 are overrepresented in the ranks of the underemployed in our country. But it's also a fact that folks under 40 are even more overrepresented in the ranks of the country's and the world's most disruptive and innovative new leaders, and in some cases, new billionaires. There is almost no measure of success beyond financial success in which the impact of people in their 20s and 30s is not changing the world. Tonight, we're going to hear from a great example of such a person with a growing impact on our culture, our economy, and our politics. I'm not going to belabor the fascinating story of Thomas Herndon that brought you all here. I hope he'll share some of that personal journey with us. But rather just say a word about the substance of the issue that his work has put into question. What is the fiscal road that the United States is on? What road should it be on? What does it mean for the world, and what does it mean for each of our own lives? We've just gone through this tumultuous period in Washington, in which this debate about the level of national debt was, in many ways, at the cornerstone of a historic confrontation. Thomas's work really goes right to the heart of that. And so, with that, please join me in welcoming Thomas Herndon to get to the heart of that matter. Thank you. Perfect.
Hi, thanks for having me. It's a pleasure to be here in Philadelphia, and thank you for inviting me to share my story. So I guess a basic overview of what I did. For my term paper, for my applied econometrics class, it started last fall. I chose to replicate a paper by a couple Harvard professors, Carmen, Reinhart, and Kenneth Ragoff. The paper, it had been cited quite heavily across the world. If you look at Google Scholar, where it had over 500 citations, it was cited quite a bit across the world in favor of kind of reducing the government stimulus policies that we had put into place to kind of deal with the effects of the financial crisis of 2008 and the resulting recession afterwards. Basically, in every basic macroeconomic 101 class, you tend to hear that when the economy goes into a serious recession and there's large amounts of unemployment of both people and resources, very much the typical policy prescription is for the government to do fiscal stimulus policies, to borrow the money, to put people back to work, and to put the resources in the economy back to work. This happened, you know, in 2008 and 2009 when we had the financial crisis, and I think it's very good the stimulus policies happened because I think it helped prevent a real serious Great Depression style recession. You know, in the Great Depression, output fell by about a third, and about a quarter of the non-farm workforce was laid off. It was just unemployed. There was a lot of people who wanted jobs and a lot of unmet needs, but for whatever reason, the market had reached an equilibrium point where they were unemployed. And the stimulus policy certainly prevented that. You know, unemployment in this country didn't get to the 25% level or anything like that, but there was a lot of criticisms that it was too small. So for example, the Chinese economy, they had a stimulus plan that in absolute levels was about the size we had. However, that's a much larger share of their economy because they have, their GDP is much smaller, and they were able to bounce back a lot quicker. The paper that Carmen Reinhart and Kenneth Ragoff published came out in 2010, a couple years after this. And what they argued is that when the debt to GDP ratio increases beyond 90%, this causes all sorts of problems for growth. Like you would expect a significant fall in growth after this point. And this was really important because the stimulus policies put a lot of the governments across the world very close to the 90% number, and in many cases a little above it as well too. And so what happened both here and abroad was the stimulus policies that had really put a floor under the economy during the recession were removed. And it had very serious effects. If you look at a comparison of the stimulus policy in 2008 to the present, it was much smaller than what we had done for the other recessions that had happened recently. There's a few graphs online that you can compare, like our response to this crisis versus the other ones. And once these started being taken away, it caused quite a bit of calamity, I guess, if you will. Unemployment in this country is still frighteningly high, sitting around 7 or 8% right now with the official number. Underemployment, though, is significantly higher, at about 15%. Across Europe, it's pushed unemployment numbers into 20%. They've had larger kind of cutbacks in the stimulus. And one of the things, when you look at the effects of cutting back, basically all the countries that cut back the most experience the biggest contractions in their economy. One of the reasons for this is because it's the nature of the recession we're in right now. When the financial crisis hit, it's not like we lost the ability to produce a whole lot of things, right? It's not like the machines in the factories suddenly melted. What happened was that there's not enough money to buy all the output that our economy can produce. And when there's not enough to buy everything we can produce, that results in unemployment. And so it's very much the job of public authorities, et cetera, to kind of close that gap between what the economy can produce and how much money there is to buy it, everything. So there's a few reasons this happens, but the result, it was very, very problematic. There's been social unrest across Europe. Certainly in this country, there's been, it's kind of fueled a lot of some of the different polarization of the debate as well. And so their paper was very instrumental in kind of promoting these type of policies. It was cited by Paul Ryan in this country. It was the only paper that he cited in his budget proposal. Across Europe, like George Osborne, Ollie Rehn, and a lot of folks across there were citing this paper to remove the stimulus policies that had really kind of helped the economy. And so I chose to replicate this paper for a few reasons. And I guess I should just say, in our applied econometrics class, every semester the students have to choose a major paper from their field and kind of reconstruct it. That's what a replication is. It's really good. You can learn quite a bit. You learn like all the techniques they're going to put in their paper, whether it's 21st century statistics or something like that. And it's really good for a researcher to do that. It kind of brings you up to the research frontier in the field. I chose the paper because it was very well known. I think Paul Krugman has said it was perhaps the most influential empirical macro paper he's seen, because it was cited by all the folks. However, when I first read the paper, I didn't agree with it. It seemed very counterintuitive. Like it went against both historical experience of how countries have dealt with recessions before, and also the basic intuition that every introductory macroeconomic textbook teaches you. And when I looked at the numbers too, I saw the median and the mean diverged a lot, which means it was probably driven by an outlier. But my intuition basically told me that something wasn't right. I just didn't feel right about their results. And so I started looking into it. The first thing I tried to do was reconstruct the paper from all the publicly available sources and the like, and I was unable to do so. I spent a semester trying to rule out any possible errors. Of course, as the student, I thought I'd clearly been the one who made the mistake. Our professors thought this too. I remember one of my co-authors, early on in the semester, I had a meeting with him. He was like, all right, Thomas, look, there's two variables and you're taking an average. It shouldn't be that hard. You need to go figure this out, like this weekend. And I was like, okay. That my heart sank quite a bit. But yeah, certainly I went home and I figured it out. Or I started to rule out the possibility of me making errors. So by the end of the semester, I had more or less been able to convince my professors that it was likely that I wasn't the one who had made an error and that something seriously wrong had happened. At this point, One of my co-authors said he was about 85% sure that I was right. But even then, like, we weren't 100% sure. And it wasn't until I had finally received the data from them, their actual working spreadsheet, and I was able to see exactly how it all was put together and the exact calculations they used, that I could tell exactly what went wrong. And we found a series of 4 total errors. One of them was just a spreadsheet error. There was 20 countries in their sample, and they only averaged 15 of them. They were supposed to average lines 30 to 49, however they averaged 30 to 44. So that was really the first error I had found. I almost didn't believe my eyes when I'd seen it. I had been working really hard on the other paper earlier that day. It was late, I was tired. So I had to ask my girlfriend to see if my eyes were tricking me or something like that. But she was like, no, Thomas, I think you're right. You need to contact Bob and Michael, my co-authors, really quickly. And so we did that. From there, it didn't take too long to turn out the paper. We turned that around rather quickly, and we published it soon after on a Monday. By that Tuesday, or the next Tuesday, a blog post from one of our friends, Mike Consul, over at the Roosevelt Institute, he wrote just a description of our paper, just to let the kind of economics, internet commentariat know about what we had found. And by noon, the paper had gone viral on the internet. Over the next couple weeks, the University Media Office said, I think we were in over 200 different media outlets across the world, all the major ones, including New York Times, Wall Street Journal, Financial Times, Economist, BBC. I was fortunate enough to be on the Colbert Report as well. And our findings kind of sparked or renewed and helped to facilitate a debate about the fiscal stimulus policies or balancing the budget in the middle of a recession. And, you know, it really renewed that type of debate. Overall, I think it's fair to say that in the economics profession, the debate has more or less concluded that austerity really was the wrong thing to do in the middle of a recession, just like everyone thought it was. You know, it really wasn't a surprise to anyone who had briefly looked at a Macro 101 book or look at, you know, the history. For example, in the Great Depression, after they had initially tried to do a lot of the type of stimulus policies which were new then, they pulled them back too quick, and it caused a double dip recession. Like, as soon as they stopped them, everything collapsed again. Well, not collapsed, but fell significantly. And so, I think it's fair to say that the consensus position in economics, though, they kind of decided that these policies really are problematic in a lot of ways. There was another paper, like a lot of, so this paper that I critiqued was one of 2 papers that had kind of been used around this time. The other one had actually been critiqued earlier by someone else from UMass Amherst, but he's at the IMF right now, so they did that Arjun Dakjai critique the other paper. And so it helped to really renew a big debate, because a lot of people knew the austerity policies, you know, were problematic, that would likely lead to increases in unemployment, not good for businesses either, because if you have mass unemployment and no one has jobs, then no one can buy the goods and services that the businesses can produce, and then they'll lay off more people, certainly won't invest, and so it was really an interesting to kind of contribute to it and facilitate this global discussion that took place both in Europe and in the U.S. And have like my paper very much at kind of the center of it. And so I'm really honored to have been able to help facilitate that process and contribute what I could to that debate. I think while policies haven't quite turned around yet, I do think it was really it was very struggling to find the word, but it felt good that a lot of our basic common intuitions and the wisdom that the economics profession gained from kind of pulling the economies out of large recessions like the Great Depression, to see that validated, because, you know, like, the economics profession did have to deal with some of these large-scale problems before, and I think many of the practical wisdom that emerged from that period, from the New Deal era or Keynes, was kind of perhaps forgotten, might be too strong a term, but certainly de-emphasized over the last 30 years in the field of economics. To see kind of a return to that and to look at that type of practical wisdom that comes from experience, I think, and see it validated again. And I thought that was, it felt good. Because sometimes, you know, when you're one of the few people who is a critic and, you know, it's kind of hard to maintain that position. You know, it's, a lot of folks will say, oh, you're crazy. You know, of course, government borrowing will just slow the economy. But, you know, so it was really, I guess it definitely was rewarding to go through experience. And also really interesting to see kind of the discussion in the media from the other side of it. Because usually I just read the news and things like that, but then to see how kind of economic policy discussion happens in the media, what's emphasized, what's not, what things are good, is really interesting. Like, you know, a lot of times in the classroom and in our seminars, we like to kind of have a lot of caveats to everything we say and to always look at both hands of the situation and things. However, the format of the media, you're more or less lucky if you have a minute. A minute would be a long time, really, to speak. And so you have to more or less communicate simpler messages. And I think it can still be done, and done honestly, but it's certainly a challenge. It's very similar to the challenges of teaching. Only, you know, then we have 50 minutes in the room with the students or whatever, and it's a lot more fun. Or not fun, but it's a little bit, you're less constrained, I would say. But kind of see that process and take place in it. And you know, I feel very honored to have been able to help to facilitate and contribute to that discussion.
So we have a microphone here to use for our Q&A period, but I guess I want to know whether we really need it in this room. Anybody in the back can't hear? Anybody can't hear? Okay, I'd rather go without it if everybody's okay. If you can hear, please speak up and we'll pick up the mic. Let me just lead off with a question. How does your work, which really has been focused on fiscal policy, spending policy, debt policy in the time of recession, how does it relate to this drumbeat, that we're hearing about the long-term fiscal picture for the United States? We hear all the time that there are unfunded liabilities in the trillions that can't be met without a level of taxation that might choke off growth. So how does your work relate to that sort of debate about the longer term?
Mm-hmm. I think one of the things that's not talked about too much is the long-run effects of mass unemployment in a recession. When people are thrown out of the workforce for extended periods of time, it's very hard for them to return to the workforce, and a lot of the skills they've developed kind of atrophy, if you will. And so and when you aren't at it, when the potential output is higher than the output you're at, like the amount of goods and services the economy can produce is higher than what's currently being bought, that also, it reduces the incentive to invest, and it'll cause further unemployment. And I think those effects can be very detrimental to long-run growth, and a lot of folks, I think, tend to discount those in their kind of analysis. I think one of the things you also see is that austerity can be actually very counterproductive. So, especially in Europe, there have been certain governments who have tried to balance their budget, right? But what they find is that contracts the economy, and in the next year, their tax revenues fall, and their debt to GDP ratio actually rises rather than falls. And so it has the exact opposite effect that they tend to have. My argument would be closer that we need to get back to full employment in the short run, and that can be done through these type of borrowing policies. And then from from there, we can then start to worry about some of the longer-term fiscal issues. Some of the longer-term fiscal issues, too, that we'll have to deal with would be things like healthcare. That's one of the largest problems. I think there's a simple answer, and it's adopting the type of healthcare systems that the rest of the world uses that seem to produce better health outcomes while using much less of a share of GDP. The rest of the world pays less for healthcare but gets much better results. And I think that can be so I think a lot of the longer term debt issues, I tend to be more skeptical. I think we try to balance the budget in the middle of the recession. What's likely going to happen is that the economy will contract and the government revenues will be less in the next period, and so it has a potential to increase the debt rather than actually reducing it. And it also has the potential to more or less destroy human beings and the productive capacity that we would use to increase growth in the long run. And so I think those are some of the ways I think about it. I tend to discount some of the fear. I think a lot of, with debt, there's such this kind of moral undertone to it. There's kind of this weird paradox in history where it's always been considered moral to pay your debts. However, any type of representations of money lenders in culture or anything like that have always been looked at skeptically. Like Keynes, I don't think the moral aspect of debt is necessarily what we should think about. I think it's more about functional finance. You look at when public borrowing can actually have really strong effects on growth, and that's usually in a recession with interest rates incredibly low, unemployment. That's the time to expect a large fiscal multiplier. And it seems like that. Keynes said that the problem is that we have magneto problems in the economy. And now, magneto is just a transmission, so he was kind of comparing the economy to a car. And I think that's very much it. It's not like the moral problem that we borrow too much and debt is always bad necessarily, but that the economy is broken and the way to fix it is quite easy. You have to inject more money into the economy so there's enough money to buy all the goods and services that we can produce. And it's interesting too because what's more wasteful than unemployment? There's like unmet needs and people who want to work. It's literally like money laying on the ground. There's unused resources that could just be put back together. We could put people back to work if we wanted to, and that would have strong effects on growth. I think a lot of the ways the economies recovered from the Second World War, especially too, managed the high debt loads then, maintained full employment, and promoted long-term growth. I think there's a lot of wisdom that we could learn from that period. That kind of, I think there's part of it is over the last 30 years or so, there's been kind of within American culture, especially, there's kind of a what's the right word? Like a general sense that the public sector can never really do anything to help economic growth. It just takes resources from the private sector. And I think that's a serious mistake. And I think there's a lot of evidence from history about different ways the public sector can step in to make the economy grow again and support that and have those type of supportive processes.
Questions? We'll start up front.
If, not being familiar with your paper, if you went back and corrected all the mathematical errors, would the interpretation of the result they would have gotten be dramatically different than what they got? And I assume that having gotten the results they did they also make conceptual errors in interpreting their faulty data?
I would say yes to both those questions. So the main result we critiqued is that when debt to GDP rises above 90%, they found that average growth was negative, negative 0.1. When we corrected that, we found it was in the mid-twos. Moreover, when we then look at their other series, and we found that once we corrected the other results, they found the ones that weren't quite as dramatic, the differences fell apart as well. Moreover, we found that the differences between the different debt categories they had were not statistically significant. The reason why is because there's more variation within each of the categories than across them. And what that means is that for each of the categories, so for example, when debt to GDP was over 90%, we saw a wide range of outcomes. There were times where countries grew slowly, but there was also times where they grew really fast. And so I think the real question is to ask, under what circumstances can countries still grow rapidly with high debt loads? And I think the answer to that is in the circumstances we find ourselves in right now. The typical argument against government borrowing is that it will crowd out private investment. The idea is that there's a fixed pool of savings and credit in the economy, and if the government takes some of that, then the private sector won't take that. Well, that argument is just not applicable right now when the interest rate is like 0. I mean, the mechanism that argument is like if the government borrows and takes that credit, then it'll raise interest rates, and no one else will borrow money. The interest rates are 0 right now. So that's not really the problem. In fact, the interest rate is actually a little bit lower than inflation. So you can actually borrow money now and have to pay back less than you borrowed. So it's really the time you want to borrow a lot of money, fix up the infrastructure, etc. In terms of the interpretation, I think there's still a shallow negative correlation between debt and growth. And I think they interpreted that by saying that slow growth causes high debt. High debt causes slow growth. What actually we find is the case most of the time is slow growth that causes high debt because countries have to borrow to get out of the recession, etc. And also, when you have slow growth, you're going to take in less in tax revenues. The government's kind of budget depends on the overall state of economic activity. And so, both in missing the causal link that it's really slow growth causing high debt, rather than high debt causing slow growth, I think that was an error in interpretation. One of my professors actually looked into this a little bit after the paper came out, and he found that the estimates, when he used basic controls for causality, the estimates fell by between 50 to 70%. So about 50 to 70% of whatever that effect was just simple reverse causation. And so I think, both on the conceptual level and in terms of just basic results, their claims fell apart.
Has the research at all touched on not just how much you're spending, but where you're spending it?
It actually has, and I encourage everyone to check out the research done by the Political Economy Research Institute. And I think that's a big thing too. When we look at the composition of the stimulus policies that were enacted in 2008 to 2009, I think there was too much of it targeted into tax cuts. Tax cuts have less of a multiplier effect than other forms of spending. So really quick, what's the multiplier? If the economy is in a recession because there's not enough spending to buy all the output, then public spending actually is a public good in that for every $1 you spend, you'll get more than $1 in output because of that. So the way you can think about it is, so say, you hire a lot of unemployed folks. Well then, they have income, they'll go spend that income, say, at the grocery store. The grocer will then go buy more stuff from their suppliers will be able to have money to pay their workers, etc. And so there's kind of a ripple effect that happens. That ripple effect is higher the more people spend the stimulus money. With tax cuts, especially for wealthier individuals, it doesn't have the same effect because a lot of the folks won't increase spending as much as someone who is, say, unemployed and unable to pay their mortgage or something like that. Those people will tend to spend everything all the stimulus, whereas the tax cuts have a much less of effect. And so that was one of the problems with the stimulus. I think in terms of industrial policy and public investment, something that's very fascinating is that things about like the transition to a green economy has a much higher, you get more jobs per $1 million you spend than say on coal or even construction, healthcare. You actually get quite a bit from things like the green economy. And so I think sensible industrial policy targeted towards things like that has the potential to really increase employment, and then also, you know, help to mitigate the effects of climate change or anything like that. The basic reason is because retrofitting buildings and things like that, you know, you can't really outsource them, you know, and it's very labor intensive too. So, for example, in the oil industry, a lot of the money is going to be going to pay for machines, and likely not in the U.S. Whereas it's very hard to outsource having to retrofit this building. You know, you can't really take care of that across the world.
One of the points that the paper was sorry.
Ken here in the back, if you could.
The paper that you're talking about, and the Rogoff Reinhart paper, was an empirical paper, right? It was not peer reviewed, was it?
So that paper itself was not peer reviewed. It originally was released as a National Bureau of Economic Research working paper in 2010. And then it was formally published in the American Economic Review, which is the top journal, or one of the top journals in the field. Usually all submissions to that are peer reviewed, but it was in a special May edition, which is the Papers and Proceedings edition. It's not peer reviewed. The president of the American Economic Association invites everybody to a conference in May, and then the papers they present at that conference are then turned into the May edition. That being said, it's really not clear that peer review would catch this error, because to be honest, on a good day, your reviewer might give your paper a long afternoon, like if they're generous. And they're certainly not going to reconstruct the data set and do all the calculations from scratch. Really, this error could only have been caught through a replication project. Now, replication, it's done in the natural sciences quite a bit more than it is in economics. More or less, scientific results aren't taken seriously until independent researchers across the world can independently reconstruct them in the same way and confirm them. In economics, unfortunately, replication doesn't have the same place, or it's not giving the same type of prestige, or just the norms for replication are much less in economics. A lot of this, economics is a publishing industry, so people want to publish, very new, interesting results. And replication, there's significant costs. My project took a semester and a half to do. And a lot of times, what happens if you spend a semester and a half doing a replication project and you find out the researcher really was solid? Now that result is actually very important for the field, because you just audited a paper and found that it was solid. However, you're probably not going to get that result published. And it certainly won't count towards tenure or anything like that. So there's kind of a coordination failure in economics, I would say. Another thing, I think it's also important to know that a lot of the papers that influence policy aren't actually peer reviewed. And the reason why is because the wheels of peer review sometimes, or very often, turn slowly. And policy needs are often a lot quicker than that. Like, someone might publish a paper, a working paper in 2010, but then it's not published until 2013 or 2012, if it is. And so there's what's called a gray literature out there, which is all these working papers that get discussed among the researchers, and this was one of them. Please.
Have you heard from the author of the original paper that you were reconstructing, and if so, what was their reaction to your response?
Yeah,
Keep
they
it clean.
Certainly we haven't had much personal correspondence or anything like that, but they've responded in the New York Times and on their website. We weren't actually quite satisfied with their response over a number of reasons. They said that our findings actually confirmed their findings, and that confused all of us quite a bit. And they never really addressed a lot of the critiques we had that their findings weren't statistically significant and they fell apart when you came to the future. So we weren't really satisfied with a lot of their responses. They did engage in some ad hominem attacks as well that we didn't really feel to be accurate representations of us as researchers or anything like that. So yeah, we were typically, I would say, we were dissatisfied. And I would say a lot of the economics profession was dissatisfied with it too. There was a lot that the typical response that people had was, well, I guess now facts don't matter. You know, that was because it was very clear. Like their results were driven by a single outlier. They had an unconventional weighting system that a single year from New Zealand in 1951 was weighted to be 1/7 of their average. And this year had really low growth. It wasn't because of high debt, it was because the dock strike shut down half the country for 6 months, and you know, being a small island, you know, imports and exports are pretty important, and they did it through the docks and the like. So I mean, you know, people weren't very satisfied, I would say, with their response, and they pointed to their medians. They said that we only critique, in our original paper, we only critiqued their average, and that was very much where their strongest claim was, and the claim that was most famous. It was in this one graph that scared a lot of folk. But you know, part of that was, you know, you could only write so much in a paper, and so we figured we'd just look at what was most wrong. But we responded to them. We're like, all right, fine, we'll look at your medians and your longer sample. When we corrected those errors, there was even less difference using those measures than with the average. And so it supported their position even less. Please.
Here's some concern about the increase in debt creating an increase in the amount of currency, causing a devaluation of our currency. And you read about other countries saying let's not use the dollar anymore as the basis. And I wonder how all this that you're talking about impacts that discussion.
Okay, thanks. So yes, typically one of the big fears about the government borrowing when you're close to full employment is that it'll cause inflation. Because if the economy is producing all the goods and services that it's like technically or feasibly capable of, and you just inject new money, then that will lower the value of the money and cause inflation. However, when you're not at full employment, you don't get those effects, and you don't get inflation. In fact, the real worry is deflation, because the problem with deflation is when the value of the dollar is higher, it's really bad for debtors. And a lot of how recessions are caused is the expansion of credit and leverage that fuels bubbles. And then when the bubbles pop, there's a lot of people who borrowed a lot of money to bet on like stocks and the like, and suddenly the value of their loans increase, so they actually have to pay off more. So the real problem is being scared of deflation. That's the first thing. Secondly, the Federal Reserve engaged in unprecedented monetary actions. It expanded the money supply like massively, and it did that. It's been about 5 years now, and we haven't seen inflation. It hasn't happened, and a lot of that is because of the particular moment we're in. We're not at full employment. We're in what's known as a liquidity trap. So a lot of times people think the economy is self-correcting. So if you there's some type of shock that decreases the overall level of spending in the economy, the interest rate falls. And so more credit is put out there so people can spend more. And that brings the economy back to full employment. Well, the interest rate can't fall anymore now. It's up against zero. So that can't stimulate demand anymore. And when you're in that, you can expand the money supply quite a bit and not have any of the effects of inflation. And one of the reasons is the banks are just sitting on a lot of money. They're not lending it right now. So even if the Federal Reserve pumps a lot of credit into the banking system, if that credit then isn't extended to the real economy, you know, it's not going to cause inflation or anything like that. About the talks about the dollar as the international reserve currency, here's an interesting thing. What happened when the market crashed, right? Like, a lot of people were very scared about the imbalances. They're like, oh, the Chinese central bank's holding all these dollars. If, like, before the financial crisis happened, people thought if a crisis happened, it might cause a big sell-off of dollars across the world, and people would be very scared of that. What actually happened was the opposite. U.S. Treasuries and the dollars were seen as like the one safe asset in the system, so everyone went to them. And that's why, you know, we're able to borrow at 0% right now and things like that. The real fear would have been what had happened if the default happened, because then the Treasury, the one safe asset in the system, would suddenly not be safe. That would have very much caused horrible problems in financial markets across the world, and that would have been really, really problematic. There are other reasons, though, that, you know, apart from U.S. monetary policy, why other countries might be skeptical of having the dollar as the international reserve currency. Actually, in international economics, there's been a large debate about having any one national currency as the international reserve currency, because it gives the country whose national currency, say the dollar, it gives them more power in the system, if you will, than others. The British had that power before us, when the sterling was part of it, and the pound. And because if you think about it, if you have the dollar as an international reserve currency, then all the other countries need to get that dollar to have their foreign exchange reserves. So they need a lot of it, and that allows us to borrow quite a bit more. We can just print it, you know. And so there could be other reasons why, because you know, there's been talks about a new reserve currency in the world too. I think, yes, we do. An international reserve currency would be a much better idea. Keynes had that idea, Bretton Woods, though Harry Dexter White was not really thrilled about that. There could be a lot of reasons. I think it would make a lot more sense to have, you know, some type of international reserve currency, but, you know, it's an old question, and I would say that the Federal Reserve monetary policy, it's not really scaring the folks across the world. There hasn't been the inflation. If anything, people wish the Federal Reserve could do more to get the U.S. economy growing again, and that would be really helpful for everybody.
Please.
What grade did you get, and has Paul Ryan seen your paper?
I'm not sure too much about Paul Ryan. I did get an A in the course, though. I certainly got an A. I would imagine that he's heard discussion of it, and I think I remember seeing some type of report or news article when someone asked him, but I imagine he just wasn't very thrilled. A lot of folks, though, that had largely cited this paper in defense of their views said their views hadn't changed, even though this paper changed. For example, Bowles Simpson, they were interviewed about it, and beforehand they kind of had the reputation of being very fact-oriented, close to the policy community, very honest, trying to get the grand bargain or something like that. When they asked if their opinions changed now that the evidence changed, they said no, and it actually looked not that well for them. They lost the reputation of being really close to the policy community to some extent.
Please.
I'm curious about the connection between your experiences and the title of the talk around being in the digital age and how that may have impacted your access to information, or perhaps the way that your paper was disseminated, or the way that policymakers are engaging with it.
So, certainly I would say that the online economics commentariat, both in the blogosphere and in kind of the internet journalism, it had a huge effect on why the paper was heard so much. Like, so if this was, back in the 1940s or something like that, the debates were going on in the Economic Journal and American Economic Review and stuff like that. Now they happen a lot faster and instantly online. And the paper went viral. That a lot of that was because there's a lot of good blogs out there with professional economists kind of engaging in that public discourse, and that economics blogosphere has kind of grown really rapidly over the last few years. And so I definitely think, and it's gotten a lot of kind of credibility for doing good analysis at times. And so I think that development of kind of that online economics commentary was kind of a platform that very much helped amplify and share the story quite a bit. I mean, I don't think it could have happened without that in nearly the same way. And also, of course, it's a lot easier to share data now. I could just ask them to send me a spreadsheet. I'll look at it. I'd rather they had given me like a script for R or Stata or something like that, but spreadsheet's fine too.
Let me jump back in and play devil's advocate a little bit more. So, two questions. First is, if 90% ratio of debt to GDP isn't, the end of the world, is there a number that, in your view, the United States should not hit? Is it 100%? Is it 120? I mean, is there some number that would worry you as an economist in terms of growth? And secondly, the prescription for deficit financing, when you talk about the historical pattern, we've balanced the budget, the federal budget, 3 or 4 times, I guess, out of the last 40 years. So we've spent more than we've taken in as a government in growth years as well as recessionary years. And the argument on a certain side of the political community is you've simply got to restrain the appetite for spending because it's really unrelated to the response to unemployment. It's just a political appetite to spend more than we have. So how would you respond to both of those things?
Okay, let's take the second one first. I would just say that's just factually inaccurate. It's interesting, or if you look, there's kind of an irony. Like, if you look at the things that really drove the deficit during the growth years, a lot of them were, say, military spending on the Iraq War, etc., or before that, the Star Wars program under Reagan, etc. The debt also cost a lot more than because interest rates were much higher during the 80s because of the Volcker shock. But before then, you do see the more or less balanced budget over the course of the business cycle. Over the last couple of years, I would say the people making that argument are honestly the ones more responsible for it. I mean, Clinton was one who balanced the budget during those growth years. So that's one. And then, what was your first question again?
If 90% is not
the
number, what is it?
So I don't think debt to GDP is a really, I don't think there's any one number that holds for all time and space. So for example, at the beginning of the 19th century, right, Britain, they were like 240 or something like that. They were huge. And what happened after that? The Industrial Revolution. A lot of it was, a lot of the development of modern economies was because the state sector helped create the market, and a lot of it was military spending in the 19th century and things like that. Building cannons and having to feed large armies and all that through market activity helped grow the market. There was like a guaranteed purchaser, and that helped a lot of businesses and things like that. Promotes innovation and the like. And there's been a lot of times, like, so what about the last time the U.S. got into, had a very high debt to GDP ratio during the Second World War? Well, what followed that was the fastest period of growth in U.S. history. And I think one of the really important things to remember with debt to GDP is that it has a denominator as well as a numerator. And so if you grow fast, the ratio falls just because the denominator grows. And I think that's a very important thing, and it's something to very much look at. But when we looked at it too, in the overnight account, there's just a wide variety of situations. And nowhere are we saying that you should just borrow profitably and at all times or anything like that, but it's looking at the specific conditions. If we were at full employment, I would say we should pay down the debt. The basic idea is over the course of the business cycle, you should balance your budget. So, but the time for austerity and paying off debt is when the economy's growing fast. It's not in the slump. Because if you cut government spending in the middle of the slump, you will actually contract the economy. And it makes sense. When talked about in abstract, it kind of sounds odd, but if there's a lot of unemployment in the economy and you lay off half the public sector, it's not clear that that's going to improve unemployment.
A lot of what you're saying is very consistent with what Paul Krugman has been saying for quite some time. But the one question I had was, how important do you think it is as to who holds your debt? For example, isn't the example given about Japan? I think their ratio is something like 115 or 120.
It's a little higher than that, actually.
But most of their debt, maybe not 100%, but well over 90, is held by Japanese citizens. So how important is it as to who holds your debt, in addition to the ratio itself?
That's certainly something that's quite important. Most U.S. debt, though, is held domestically, though there is quite a bit of treasuries in the international market because the U.S. is the main reserve currency. I think almost more important is what currency your debt is denominated in. So if you owe dollars and you have the ability to create dollars, it's a lot easier to pay off the debt than if you owe dollars and your currency is the yen or something like that. And I think that's also a big distinction that really matters for kind of debt management. It's one of the reasons why the UK is probably much better positioned to manage large amounts of debt than Greece or something like that.
Time for one last question. I see one over here. Please.
I see Eugene Fama or Bob Schiller sitting with us. My question is simple. What future research are you doing, and how do we hear about you more?
Oh, thanks. So currently I'm writing my dissertation, or I'm just starting it. Like this paper was interesting. It was part of the last coursework I was doing for the PhD program, and now I'm in the dissertation phase. Some of my the research is there's kind of a few different strands, but a lot of it is topics in finance and debt management. So one is kind of like a historical study of the U.S. financial structure and institution and the forces that caused the unprecedented increase in leverage and instability that led up to the financial crises. But then another part are different tools we have to deal with the current problem. So one of the current problems is what's known as deleveraging, or people having to pay down all their debt. That reduces spending in the economy. And there's serious distributional effects to it all as well, in that, for example, the financial institutions, a lot of them were made whole, and there's a term called the burden of adjustment. And the burden of adjustment wasn't really on the financial institutions. They had a more or less comprehensive insurance system through the Fed, just bailing them out more or less. But U.S. households were not bailed out. So throughout the crisis, there was a foreclosure crisis that hit that actually very much made the recession worse. Moreover, currently while I don't think public debt overhangs are to be worried about too much, private debt overhangs, especially in the household sector, is really problematic. And currently, about 20% to a quarter of the mortgages in this country have negative equity in them. So that people owe more than the house is worth. And this also contributes to mass defaults, foreclosures, etc. And one thing the government could have done that they did do during the Great Depression is write down that debt. They wrote down the debt of the financial institutions, but not the household sector. And if they had done that, that would have promoted growth quite a bit. and it can result in net savings. So the CBO just put out a report in May that said for just the loans that are in default right now or in serious problems, they haven't made their mortgage payments in 60 days or something, and just the ones that are owned by Fannie Mae or Freddie Mac, they're looking at sliver about 660,000 of them. If they wrote down the principal on that to just the market value, so that people didn't owe more than the value of the home, which I would note, if you have negative equity on a home, it's rational for you to default. Based on all the models, it's rational to get out of it as quick as you can. And the phrase "don't chase bad money with good" kind of falls into that. But if they wrote those down, it would result in about 2.8 billion net savings. So it wouldn't cost anything to get something out of it. And the reason why is because a smaller income stream from people in the home is better than none, which is what happens when you foreclose folks. And so this is kind of a big distributional issue because those loans are assets on bank balance sheets, and they are all at the pre-crisis level. Home prices fell by 1/3, and it wasn't like homeowners that caused that. It was problems in the financial system that caused that bubble. But they put the burden of adjustment on, the U.S. population, and the result has been horrible foreclosures and a lot of unnecessary pain and suffering. They could have wrote it down. They could do the write-downs in a much larger scale. Anyone who's looked into the homeowner loan corporation that happened in the Depression, they did wide-scale loan modifications and writing down of debt, and it cost the government just a trivial amount. Some estimates are very small costs, some positive savings, and so that could have been done, and there was actually a lot of kind of bipartisan consensus around it. They left it to the financial sector, and the financial sector decided they would rather foreclose more or less than negotiate. And I think it's hard to find words bad enough to describe how I feel about that. I think it was a lot of unnecessary pain and suffering for a lot of folks who didn't have to.
I want to thank Thomas for